All right, friends, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about Venus going through the sign of Scorpio. This video will apply if you have this in your natal chart as well as the upcoming transits. This year, Venus is going to ingress into the sign of Scorpio on November 7th, and it will be there until the end of the month on the 30th. And you know what? I feel like I'm keep doing planets in the same sign. And this has been going on since last year because all the planets are keep clustering together. We had the Pisces situation and then the Aries situation. And now we're in this sector of the chart. We're moved from Virgo to the cluster in the sign of Scorpio. And this trend will continue for a bit until next year. But here we are. We're going to be talking about displacement. And what we have to do, we have to start with the fact that Venus, the planet of love, very soft, all about harmony, beauty, the arts, is moving into a very fierce sign. So Venus is coming into an environment where its gentleness is going to be compromised. This is an environment related to the depths, to secrecy, to defiance, individuality. And we're talking about the planet of cooperation and harmonizing everything and creating a union. And we have to remember, Scorpio is ruled by Mars. So when Venus comes here, it's like, oh my God, I can't establish union through cooperation. I have to do this through power dynamics. And there's a kind of a psychological depth here in the sign of Scorpio. So things can't be surface level. It's intense. And it's also important to remember that Venus in the sign of Scorpio is opposing its own sign of Taurus. So Venus, it's in its exile. It's as far as it can be from its own home. We can kind of conceptualize Venus as Inanna in the Sumerian narrative mythology, where Inanna is Venus and she had to descend into the underworld and to face a lot of trials and tribulations before she could reascend back up. And I'll get to this point actually at the end of the video. But for now, I want to get into the core of the video. And before doing so, all the aspects that are going to be made in the sign, I'll make a video about that later because Venus and Jupiter are going to have a beautiful trine. And then later on, Venus is going to make a trine to Saturn from the sign of Scorpio. And it's also going to make that conjunction with Mercury while it's in its retrograde phase. So I'll make a video about those. And if you guys are interested, press subscribe, the notification button, so you're notified when those videos come out. And now before moving on, I just want to give you the structure of the video. We're going to talk briefly about Venus and then the sign of Scorpio. Venus in the sign of Scorpio, and then some of the negative and positives that can come out of this, some life lessons, and then we'll wrap it up. And the video's timestamped, so if you guys want to move back and forth, please feel free to do so. Now, without further ado, let's get right into the video. And we shall start with the symbolism of Venus. And one of the first things we have to remember, this is talking the law of attraction. It's the gravitational current in existence that can draw separated parts together and establish a union. So in a lot of ways, Venus is the principle of coherence. We could see it as a drive or an intelligence of existence and something, a drive that is within us, that knows how to synthesize things that are opposite to each other, bring them together, create a connection, and allow them to merge and unify. It's through Venus that life finds the impulse to merge and to connect, or better to say to connect and then to merge, because the connection part is just Mercury. The merging part belongs to Venus. And if you think about it, the state required for this kind of an action is to be soft, is to be receptive, is to be adaptable. And these factors become very important when we talk about the fixed nature of Scorpio coming up next. And another thing, Venus also represents our five senses. And what are the five senses? They're the instruments of our soul and our being in order to have the ability to know things, to experience things. Like we know the world through touch, smell, taste, sight. These are the pathways that allows us to experience the external world and to allow our internal worlds to unify with the external world and vice versa. And as I mentioned earlier, Scorpio has a psychological slant. So when it comes to the five senses too, as we'll see, they're going to become very psychological in how we assess our own internal processing and the external world. And then I want us to also understand the contrast here between, let's say, Taurus and Scorpio, where Taurus is Venus's own sign. Taurus has a lot to do with stability, groundedness. It's abundant, it's fertile. There's a lot of opulence in the sign of Taurus. So we're talking about the security paradigm of life. But in Scorpio, we have to flip this paradigm on its head. The sign of Scorpio has a lot to do with the insecurity paradigm. And that's why there's a sense of defiance in it, so that we learn how to get things for ourselves. That individuality that's in this sign is also about this. So again, going back to the five senses, taste becomes something that becomes a strong craving for Venus in the sign of Scorpio, because it has to become so strong that it's something that we really want to go out there and get tenaciously, and then to possess it because of that scarcity paradigm that's there. Like in every sense of the word, in the sign of Scorpio, Venus is forced to go beneath, underneath, to get psychological, to be able to negotiate with itself and the world out there. So in a lot of ways, Venus, with all of its softness and receptivity, gets a little bit rough around the edges. It has to lose its softness in the sign of Scorpio. And because of this, even this lovely planet in the sign can sometimes bite. It can sometimes burn. And sometimes it can leave very deep scars. And a lot of it has to do is because of this defiant nature that's in the sign of Scorpio. Venus in some ways has to know how to get into psychological warfares. And it's really at the bottom of it, when we dig, there's a element that one has this feeling that I need to survive or out-survive a situation. So it gets conditioned that way. And the transits too, we'll start to see these kinds of trends. But let's get a little bit deeper into the sign of Scorpio and what Scorpio is. The first thing, Scorpio is a fixed water sign, and the water element of it is saying something about emotions. And we're talking about depth of emotions in the sign of Scorpio. And it's Mars' sign, so it comes to have those emotions relating themselves to the notion of passion. And is a kind of passion that is hardened into resolve of me. I'm going to get it for myself. It has that kind of a feeling. And it's also Mars's feminine sign. So it's supposed to be an environment that's receptive because of that feminine principle that's been injected into the sign. But its receptivity also has this element of being unyielding, relentless, tenacious, ferocious. So in order to establish reciprocity, and being receptive in this sign requires a tremendous amount of trust. It's not like Cancer, oh, let me just hug you. It wants to know who it's hugging, what it's given up for that hug. And we could also say Scorpio's motion is inwards. It's penetrative, and what I mean by that, it's very psychological. Like Scorpio people don't just accept on a superficial level what's happening around them. They want to know what's beneath it, what's driving you to do it, what's your motive, what's your intent. And another thing about this sign, that defiance thing, it's saying something about its strength, right? It's a strong sign. For instance, it's been related to having very strong emotions, opinions, and desires. And for any human being to express those inner facets of themselves, you need quite a bit of strength. And its strength is also related to the fact that it's talking about the depth of things. Where things are dark, we're dealing with the unknown. And that too requires psychological strength. And I want to say something about the fixed nature of the sign when it is at its best. Positive aspect of it. It can be about extreme loyalty, a fierce kind of a devotion. And again, it's that fixed nature, that fixed water. It's held, it's contained. It's condensed and it's guarded. That's what it's denoting. And this is how it connects itself to extreme loyalty and devotion. But this really means that the person has that inner sense of security within themselves before they can do this. And as I was saying, this sign is saying something about the insecurity paradigm. So it actually requires a lot from the native and through this transit for us to have this component of Scorpio. But it's very possible when it's functional. And another thing about the water component of it, all the water signs are denoting moksha as its goal of life. And moksha is to ultimately be liberated from the suffering of life, the way we are bound to the human condition, to this container and all of the suffering that comes with it. But moksha is never achieved through escape. It's about actually seeing what is real. And the moksha of Scorpio is about liberating oneself from fears of life, about the unknown, the darkness, the things contained in our subconscious and unconscious mind that comes forward and even surprises us, or when the world does it. And to sum up Scorpio, that strength that's in the sign of Scorpio, it can stare right into the abyss and say, I will know what this is, even if it kills me. There's a lot of courage in this sign. We have to remember is Mars' sign. But let's now bring Venus directly and explicitly into the sign of Scorpio and to see what they are symbolically representing. First thing we have to remember, because Venus represents love and relationships, this is one of the key things that we have to talk about. And in the sign of Scorpio, love is not gentle. And that's because Venus is moving into the realm of Mars. It's moving into an environment of that scarcity paradigm where there are a lot of needs, very strong desires, and a tenacious individual, self-oriented way of wanting to get things. It's really about the question of how do I get what I want for myself? Whereas Venus is like, all right, how do I compromise with you and be diplomatic? So we meet somewhere in the middle ground. That's a natural nature of Venus, and it's coming into a sign that is suddenly getting a self-orientation. But not only that, it has a lot of defiance and independence here with a lot of needs. So love here is nothing like the previous sign, which is Venus's own sign in the sign of Libra. It's not about cooperation, equality, reciprocity, or working very hard to establish peace. Venus finds herself in an environment that's about power dynamics, power relations. Love and relationships are not about creating a comfortable situation. In a lot of ways, it's about how do I tenaciously get what I need and want and desire from this love? That's a kind of a mindset with this kind of a placement. Love has an objective. Like the natives of this kind of a placement, they'll even have a visual of who the ideal partner is. And when you dig underneath that, why is that vivid imagery there? Because they have a certain kind of a need and desire that they want to fulfill. And again, going back to that scarcity paradigm, it's not a benign, I want something or I desire something here either. Because of that scarcity, not only you want it, you want to possess it. So it just keeps adding intensity on top of intensity. And to understand this inner intensity, we have to understand that psychological component that's in this sign in general, and especially when you bring the planet of senses, how it accentuates this. Like we sense what we sense internally, but those senses will then produce an outward expression which allows us to engage with the external world. But in the sign of Scorpio, everything turns inward. For example, even something as benign as sight turns into insight. The tactile factor, the touching, becomes a way of testing waters. Taste become a kind of a discernment that has to do about the judgment of a situation. Smell even becomes a kind of an intuition that you're getting, like you smell someone's scent, and then the mind starts going into categories of the mind of trying to see what's underneath it, what type of person was this kind of a clone or perfume. In a way, the senses become an instrument to detect things that lay beneath things that most people will overlook. Venus in Scorpio is always trying to sense the subtleties of what's in the environment and what's in other people. So Venus in Scorpio is constantly assessing the atmosphere of where it is. Like you could be saying something to them, yeah, they're hearing it, but they're not necessarily hearing you. They're doing this internal processing of everything that's in between these words. They want to know your intent, your motives, and that's because they have to understand the power currents in this sign. They'll be listening very carefully, let's say, to your tone of voice to pick up any kind of falseness that's coming through. When you touch them, they're not assessing how it feels. It's how close or how distant you actually are. Again, going between your words and everything that they're picking up, they're assessing for betrayal, as an example. Has this person betrayed me and are they covering it up now? And in a lot of ways, psychological sensitivity is a gift, but at the same time, it can feel like a curse. And that's because before they fine-tune these senses, they're picking stuff up. They can't really understand and decipher it for themselves. This requires maturity. And even when you have the maturity, it's hard to express it to other people. So it's something that they always have to keep within. Like you might be picking up on the fact that someone feels suspicious because it's coming from your gut feeling, but to convey that to another person and to transmit everything that just went through you, it's almost impossible. And this is where that tenaciousness and that fierceness is coming from, the strength. They really have to start trusting their own gut feeling in this sign. because they will not get external confirmation. But going back to love, the experience of love for Venus in the sign of Scorpio is generally very intense. Like the natives of Venus in Scorpio, they want love deeply. But at the same time, there's almost like a paradox here that they fear love at the same time, especially with Venus here, because Venus is encouraging us to merge and to unify. This sign is like, I need to keep my sense of individual self. I have dreams, I have goals, I have passions. I can't sacrifice that for love. And that's because on some level, whether conscious or subconsciously, they know that when you love someone, to some degree, that very strong self-identification that you have of this is who I am has to get softened up and merge into another person. This is way too risky in the sign of Scorpio to do, because in the sign of Scorpio, it feels like someone's facing their own annihilation. They're becoming too vulnerable. If they can't meet their own needs, who's going to meet their needs? If they can't fulfill their own heart's desire, who's supposed to fulfill it? And as I was saying earlier, it's very hard for them to trust. To now put that trust that another person will help you is not something that comes naturally to this sign. And with Venus now coming here as the planet of love and relationship, all of these things start to merge and get mixed up with Venus's qualities. Like the death of the self, the individual self, for the sake of unifying for another, can often feel like a price that is too high to pay. And one of the things that this does is to create fears around love and soft emotions in general. And I was talking about the moksha aspect of it. Is about overcoming fears. This is one type of a fear. Fear of vulnerability. Fear of giving up your internal content to someone else. Fear of merging with another and then feel like you're losing yourself. You're getting derailed from your goals. So now that we have a sense of what Venus feels like in the sign of Scorpio, let's just move to some of the positive aspects of this placement before going into the shadows, because they get deep and heavy. And there's dissonance between Venus and the sign of Scorpio, even though they're both a feminine sign. This is actually one feminine sign where both of the feminine planets, Moon and Venus, don't do so well here. Moon is debilitated here, and Venus just gets disturbed in a lot of ways. So for us to express these positive qualities, we're talking about enormous amount of maturity. These archetypes need to mature within us so that we can manifest their positive iteration. And for people who have this in their natal chart, well, this is saying this is a lifelong thing. You have this placement because you're working through most likely topics that have to do with love, connection, as well as the sensual and the sexual aspects of life. But we will all get these through transits because we're learning these lessons in small increments. Our soul needs these lessons. And always look at the house that the sign of Scorpio is sitting in, because it's telling you all of these narratives are unfolding through the themes and the people of that house. But let's get into the positives. Like one of the things that we can talk about here when the sign is functional, a strand of courage, which has to do with going beneath things and trying to understand the truth of things. For example, to understand the motive and the intent of someone's action is to actually see what's driving that action. So it's looking for the truth. So when it comes to relationship and love life, when this placement's functional, it gives us the courage to really go underneath the psychology of why we love this person. So this placement has the tenacity and the audacity to go past the comfort zone to dig in, to confront maybe even things that are unpleasant. Like I love this person because of my own fear, for example. And we have to recognize that in order to work through that, to remove the fear component. So it's just about loving that person. So this sign is very capable, or this placement is very capable of doing this. Because here there's just an instinct to want to face the truth, what's real. And when I say what's real, not in a Saturnine kind of way, but like what's the makeup of this thing? What's underneath it that's holding up this appearance? So there's an inner courage to face things that are messy, to go into places that are dark and complicated. And Scorpio in general will have this uncompromising feeling within, like, I don't want to deal with fake people. And what it means by fake people is shallow and superficial people. Because there's a deep desire, again, to know what's beneath things. They want to know what are the real feelings at play here. I know it's actually not uncommon during transits of Venus through Scorpio where someone's like, I need to go see a therapist. Like, I need to understand my own motives. Why do I keep going through these relationships? Why do I get attracted to these same people? Or to have couples going through couples therapy, because they're just trying to get to the bottom of what it is that connects them or what is preventing true connections. So in many ways, when Venus in Scorpio is functional, is permitting us to see our shadows, especially when it comes to the relational dynamics of our life. And if you think about it, almost all of our shadows are related to the ways that we've been conditioned to connect with the world and to other people. That's when we project. We lie to ourselves. We lie to other people. And there's another kind of a courage. It takes a lot to look at a partner that you once upon a time fantasize about and idealize, and look at them and be like, all right, you're human, and that means that you have shadows, you have complexities, you have imperfections, and I do too. Let's figure it out. Venus in Scorpio, because of that loving factor that is in Venus, it's still accepting. So it's willing to go into the shadows and into the darkness with the people that they love to work through things. A lot of people fear this. But let's move on to point number 2. And this part has a lot to do with emotional sovereignty as one of the positives of Venus in Scorpio. And this part actually requires a person to be very mature. A lot of times, a lot of us don't realize that circumstances are choosing our relationships, that we're actually waiting for other people to choose us. But when this Venus in Scorpio is healthy, it has the capacity to choose for itself freely. It's a Venus that feels secure in an insecure environment. So you can imagine what this Venus has gone through, what the native has gone through to get to a point where they're like, I know who I am. I know what I'm about. I know what I want. That desire that's in the sign of Scorpio will never go away. But when it's refined, the person understands what they want, or they have an explicit understanding that no one in this world can complete them. That is a task that is for them, for their individual self to work out in this world. So they actually free other people, because a lot of people do this. They choose another person to complete them, and it's being done through projection, manipulation, a whole bunch of devastating ways just to keep the person and to get them to do what it is that they need so that they feel that they're whole. But this experience, Venus in the sign of Scorpio, is not looking for dependency, is not come and save me, oh my God, I'm dying, and then manipulating you to do it. Like, this is a Venus who's like, this is where I begin and end. This is where you begin and end. I will not fuse with you to a point where I disappear. Nor do I want you to fuse with me to a point that you disappear. They'll actually look for the kind of love that will make them feel more like themselves. So that merging component of Venus where things can lose differentiation has a different slant in the sign of Scorpio when it's working positively. It augments to that sense of one's own individuality, their own needs, their own inner desires and opinions and thoughts. And emotions, of course. So there's a quiet confidence in relationships when this placement is mature. And lastly, as a point, there's a alchemy of truth being concocted here with Venus in the sign of Scorpio. And what I mean by that is because they're always looking underneath things, like what are people's intent, their motive, what drives them. They have this perceptual sharpness. And Venus, because of that feminine principle, will have the notion of compassion in it. So they can look at you and without you even explaining, they'll understand the fear underneath your desire. They'll see the tenderness behind your anger, your vulnerability that is causing the anger. They might see how you're dealing with grief underneath the need for all the control that you're exerting. And that's what I mean by the alchemy of emotions. They understand what the emotion itself is made of. And because of this, they can actually bring a lot of compassion. They can understand your inner truth before you even understand it. And when it comes to the domain of relationships, this can generate deeper conversations, stronger connective tissue. You just don't have to pretend with them anymore. And that's a beautiful feeling, to be able to sit beside someone that you love, say something from your heart, and they can read between of the anatomy of that statement and to understand what it's made of, where it's coming from, why it's of concern. The gift here is to turn pain into clarity, for example, for themselves or for other people. But this requires tremendous amount of self-knowledge and understanding about how life work and other people work. But before that, we're going to get a lot of shadows out of this placement, and that's what we'll be discussing next. And I'm going to take a very short break. I will be right back. All right, guys, just went for that break. I just had a cold recently, and I'm like, I hope I don't sound like a robot. I can feel the grogginess in my voice. But let us move on, and my apologies if I do sound like a robot in this video. Okay, point number one, we're going to have addiction to intensity. And we've got to remember, we're talking about when this placement of Venus in Scorpio becomes somewhat dysfunctional. So it's expressing its shadows. And this transit can also bring these kinds of feelings. So the natives will be dealing with them in the long haul of life, but through the transit, these feelings and ways of being can be evoked in us. And what I mean by that is that love rarely feels light. There can be a tendency to equate depth with creating drama. It can feel like peace means the absence of passion. So when relationships become a little too calm, the psyche will start to stir some conflicts in the background and slowly bring it to the forefront. And all of it just to feel alive again. So pleasure becomes entangled with tension. And to feel pain, it's almost like having proof that something real is happening. So it's kind of an attempt to feel alive. And we've got to remember this sign is dealing with hidden stuff. So all the surface stuff, everyday stuff, mundane things, real life, as it's happening around us, it can feel like it's not enough. It's not spicy enough. So you can feel alive through crisis and trauma rather than the peacefulness that can come from a connection or a relationship. And we have to remember we're creating tremendous amount of exhaustion in other people. We're making them reactive. We're making life very unpleasant. Like Venus and Scorpio people in general have a tendency to exhaust people around them, especially in a relationship that are intimate. And this is something they have to learn through a lifetime, that not everything needs to go to the depth. You don't have to have fiery passion at all times. You don't have to have deep emotions at all time. Life is just moving forward, and we just got to learn how to move with that. We don't need to keep throwing stones into the water and to create ripples as proof that there's water there. Like Venus and Scorpio people are the people who go to their partner and constantly say, I don't feel like there's enough passion in this relationship. Do something more. Give me something more. Again, that's scarcity paradigm that's coming here, right? In some ways, they can only feel their inner depth when this sign is acting dysfunctional, when there's a lot of drama and tension. This is something we need to work on. Shadow number 2 is about control and manipulation. And a lot of this is coming from the fear of loss, which can feel very overwhelming. And this is because Venus, as the feminine principle, feels acutely. So this is a sign of Scorpio. So they're always anticipating emotions, and before that maturity is always anticipation of negative emotions, like I'm going to be betrayed by this person. So what they do in response, they act preemptively. They cannot tolerate even the thought of feeling powerless for a moment. So they're going to exert their power in this moment, even though nothing's happening, not to be placed into that kind of a situation. And as I was saying earlier, they can read the undercurrent of other people's emotion with high degree of precision. But we have to understand that when we feel insecure within our being, our interpretation of a lot of these things can get distorted. So the insights that comes out of this is a defense mechanism rather than a fair assessment. So for this sign, it's not uncommon for them to constantly trying to test their partner's loyalty or other people's loyalty. And the way that they do this, they might withhold affection. They can even manipulate the dynamic to create attachment and dependency. They become very apt at controlling the flow of love, because if you depend on them, then they can't leave you. But we just have to understand that the more we try to control other people in these ways because of our own insecurity and lack of trust, genuine intimacy will eventually suffocate and die. It will drown. Like the person that's with them, they're not staying anymore because they love you. They're staying in the relationship from some kind of a fear. And because the natives are constantly dealing with fear, they can project those fears and instill it or install it in other people. We want people who stay with us because they love us, not because they fear a life circumstance or they fear us. So this placement have to understand that there's a difference between safety and dominance and being overwhelming and overpowering. In a lot of ways, they have to learn how to trust themselves rather than constantly testing other people to see if they're trustworthy. Shadow number 3. Lot of possession and jealousy. And there's kind of a funny thing that happens here. They become possessive. They want to own the totality of you, the whole of you. And yet, if the whole of you comes into their life, they feel like they're being erased off. So they got this thing of clinging on with an iron grip and at the same time pushing you away with an iron fist. It's like, what's happening? Am I in or am I out? Like they're constantly fighting you to merge with them. I want to merge with you. And then the minute that you start merging with them, knives and swords out, just trying to sever and cut these mergers. So this push and pull, this emotional push and pull creates a lot of turbulence in their relationships. And then what they do is they corner themselves and their partner into a game of survival. Instead of looking at it that, hey, 2 is greater than 1, we have more power, we can thrive, they get themselves and the other people into a survival mode. And their jealousy half the time is not about even like you looked at someone else or you want someone else. It's like jealousy in terms of you took something that's mine, that was of me, and now you have it. It's almost like the anxiety or a battle over losing oneself or one's own identity. This is something that this placement needs to get a good sense of maturity, that to love someone and to connect and to unify doesn't have to mean you have to get erased off. And you don't have to create all these tension points to feel like you're self-possessed. Shadow number 4 has to do with seduction and revenge. Like you do not want to wound a Venus in Scorpio person because they're going to come back with vengeance. They become sharp, defensive, stingy, poisonous, even toxic when this placement's acting very dysfunctional. Another thing under the same banner is that the act of seduction and Venus in Scorpio can be very seductive. It can be a strategy. Like part of the seduction and revenge can be just going into a silent mode suddenly. And not because they want some silence and some quietude. They're actually punishing you through that silence. They can withhold sex and affection, or they'll use sex and affection as leverage to get their revenge. It becomes a weapon rather than a means and a mode of connecting with another person. And usually this kind of cruelty comes out when they feel very powerless. Like if you betray or humiliate a Venus in Scorpio, these are the kinds of behaviors you will get in return. They will punish. That's what happens when this placement's dysfunctional. And there's a mistaken thing about this here, that they can heal themselves by making you less powerful, but we all learn eventually that revenge is undignified. It never restores dignity. And let's go to the last shadow of Venus in the sign of Scorpio, which has to do with self-sabotage through testing other people again. Like when love feels uncertain for other people, they try a little bit harder with the other person. But Venus in Scorpio will actually turn up the volume to test other people. And sometimes it does this to the point of absolute destruction and break of the relationship. And the way they self-sabotage is that they create a lot of distance between themselves and other people, or they start rejecting their partner. But when we look at this, it's a shadow because it's coming from previous psychological wiring of the person. Is that they're unconsciously recreating the pain of the past and trying to work through it. And in psychological term, they call this repetition compulsion. And it's really about mastering an old wound by replaying it again in another situation, recreating it. And if awareness and self-knowledge does not prevail here, one of the things that can happen with this sign, that they experience the same kind of outcome in the relational dynamics over and over. And then they wonder, why am I keep ending up with the same person? Why is it that everyone acts the same way? Why do my relationships end the same way? They don't understand that the way that they're testing the other person, they're kind of pushing them towards that role. There is no choice but to get that same outcome. It's like constantly creating moments of crisis to be able to understand that initial trauma. So they sabotage their own relationship, they sabotage themselves, because a lot of time they want to be with their person, whoever that they're with. But it's just like this compulsion, just can't help it. And that's something that we have to work through. And when we come to the life lessons of this placement, we have to seek love without this notion of ownership, possessing it. We have to learn how to be honest about our own emotions and refrain from wanting to inflict pain on other people. This placement needs to learn the art of trust, what it means to trust other people. And the more that we can actually trust life and trust other people, the more that gut feeling that we get in this sign with this kind of a placement, the more trustworthy those intuition and gut feelings become. And we have to trust that love can survive truth and that vulnerability is not a death sentence. And Scorpio always has this, because it has that psychological slant. A mature Venus in Scorpio can become the person who's the healer in the relationship. And ultimately, the greatest challenge in the sign of Scorpio in general is how can I feel secure? How can I feel that I've had my needs met, my opinions count, my desires count? And when it comes to Venus, we're talking about our relational dynamic, especially our intimate relationships. So we got to know how to engage without hitting back and without being stingy here. I would say Venus in the sign of Scorpio is the descent of beauty into darkness and is about cultivation of trust that truth can emerge from the depth and from this darkness. And before closing this video, we've gotten to the end of it. Please do remember to like, share, and comment. And this is one of the most fascinating placements. So if you have this Venus in Scorpio, I'd love to hear your experiences as well as how you're experiencing this transit. And if you want your own chart read, you can go to the description box below. The email's there, or you can go to parisayazdi.com and I have more information there for you. And in closing this video, I actually like to bring you back to the narrative and the myth of Venus as Inanna. And Venus in Scorpio is a representation of Inanna's descent into the underworld. Venus in Scorpio is telling us that beauty cannot be skin deep. So in the myth of Inanna, Inanna is the queen of the heavens, which is Venus in Sumerian myths. She hears a great call from the below. So she decides to go to the underworld and her sisters in the underworld. And as she's descending to the underworld, which included 7 gates, she had to remove something that was adorning her. So she takes off her crown as she goes through one layer, her jewels as she goes through another, her robes. So in a lot of ways, she had to lose all the ornaments of her identity, things that were giving her her power externally. So by the time she actually arrives to the underworld, she's bare and naked. And if you think about it, bare and naked is to be without the defense of external beauty, being without a title. It's about having been stripped down to her essence. And in the underworld, she meets her own shadow. The story can be interpreted that way, which is her sister, Orishkagel. She, as a queen of the underworld, could be interpreted as the one who's unloved, unseen. And if we say this sister is the shadow of Inanna herself, it's the part of her that holds grief and rage. The sister is the one who rules over what must die. And again, to remind you, what dies cannot be the truth. Only the truth is eternal. So we could see that this Venus in the sign of Scorpio and Inanna in the underworld is about how to love deeply, truly. It's not about controlling others to have our own desires met, but to acknowledge our own unacknowledged desires. We have to face those parts of ourselves that have been rejected so that we don't compulsively recreate those relationships in the future. We have to face the fear of loss, the pain of abandonment, the hunger for control. In a lot of ways, Venus in the sign of Scorpio is about facing the shadows of beauty, the way that love without truth becomes bondage. And to go back to the story, in the story, Inanna is pretty much killed or barely alive. That's how it's described. And she's hung on a hook upside down. So it's denoting a moment of symbolic death. When love itself, the queen of the heavens, the queen of love, had to die to its illusions. True love cannot hold any illusions. And in the story, she doesn't remain there. Through compassion and remembrance, she's restored back into life and rises again. It is the god who comes back to the overworld, understanding both light and darkness. And for any of us who understands this duality, it gives us a tremendous amount of power to be able to deal with life in general, because it's always about this interplay. And Venus in Scorpio, this is what it's learning through this exile. It's learning the wisdom of depth, beauty that can actually include shadows. And even though it feels like a descent to have Venus in Scorpio, is not a punishment. Is a kind of an initiation. It's the initiation to understand, and only true beauty and true love can outsurvive death. That's it for today. Sending you much love. Till next time.